إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Last thing we talked about was the mu'adhal hadith, which is that there's two or more people missing in the chain in a row. The next thing that the author says, he says, وَمَا أَتَى مُدَلِّسًا نَوْعَانِ الْأَوَّلُ الْإِسْقَاطُ لِلشَّيْخِ وَأَنْ ينقل عمن فوقه بعن وأن والثاني لا يسقطه لكن يصف أوصافه بما به لا ينعرف. So the next thing that the author is talking now about is the Muddallas or the Muddallas hadith. So he says, and that which comes concealed. So he translates Muddallas as concealed. I've been translating it as like cheating or something like that. He says, and that which comes concealed, its types are two in version. The first of these is by dropping the teacher. The first of this is by dropping the teacher and relating from above him, using terms like from and that. The second does arise not by dropping, but when you describe those traits of his by which he is not recognized. So here he's going into the issue of Tadlîs, which I alluded to a little bit earlier when we were talking about the mu'an'an hadith, or when a person narrates a hadith saying from, because it's a type of phrasing that doesn't necessarily indicate that the person has heard from their shaykh or even met them. It could be, or it also couldn't be, or it could be not that they didn't actually hear. So it's a phrasing that is unclear. So we'll talk about a Tadlîs now. So a Tadlîs, it comes from the word al-Dallas, and al-Dallas is when there's a mix or mixing between light and dark. So it's not pure light and it's not pure dark. So they call it this because it's as if when the person is a Muddallis and they narrate a hadith in that way, they're narrating it in a way that it's not clear. It's not clear that they didn't hear it, and it's not clear that they did hear it. So they're giving the indication that it could be this or this. So there's a mixing of truth and falsehood. So Tadlîs is something that's frowned upon. Imam Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, who was one of the early imams of hadith, he used to say that Tadlîs is the brother of lying, because even though they're not clearly lying, in the end the point of it is the same. It's to give some sort of indication or or alluding to the fact that they might have heard this when in reality they haven't. So they're not openly lying, but the end result is the same. And he used to say things like, if I was to fall from the sky is more beloved to me than if I was to perform Tadlîs, or that if I was to perform zina, it would be more beloved to me than if I was to perform Tadlîs. So he took it very seriously, and after him, or in his time and then after him, the scholars of hadith began to really investigate the issue of Tadlîs in trying to find out who was performing it and who wasn't, because it was a big issue in the sense that you have someone who possibly could have heard from someone, but he isn't saying that he did or didn't. So it's in that gray area that really needs a high level of investigation. So that's why they began to give it such a level of attention, due to the harms that would come from it. So the author describes Tadlîs as being two types. So Tadlîs in general, we say that it's a type of weak narration, and the reason for this is, as we said, like it's not possible to verify whether this person heard from him or not. So this is the reason why it's an actual defect. So the two types that the author mentions, or he mentions two types. So one of them, as he says, that he removes or he drops his teacher or his shaykh, and then he narrates it from the person after him by using the word an or an. So for example, instead of saying my shaykh, I heard from my shaykh, that he heard from his shaykh, and then so on, he'll remove his shaykh from the chain and then say from so and so, and then so he'll go straight to his shaykh's shaykh. So he skipped someone now, and this was generally done if that person was considered weak. So they didn't want to be attributed or have something come from them in a weak chain, so they would attribute it to the person above their shaykh, due to the the benefit in the sense that weak narrator is dropped from the chain now. But they wouldn't clearly say that I heard it from that person, because that would be an outright lie. They would say from so and so, from so and so. So technically it is from him, so there's no lie in that. But you heard it from someone that you've intentionally dropped from the chain. So it's and obviously for a reason. Other times maybe they might perform it that way, not necessarily because the person that they're narrating from directly is weak, but they might do it because they might want to have a shorter chain of narration, or they might want to narrate directly from someone that they really in reality didn't narrate from. But because we won't always be able to tell who is in between them in the chain, then it would be in any case it would be considered a defect. So this is called Tadlîs al-Shuyûkh. There's different types of Tadlîs. This is the first one that the author described. And then the second type of Tadlîs is that they narrate from someone, and they actually describe them, but they describe them in a way that they're not necessarily known by. So they would, instead of saying, for example, if there's a narrator who's known as Muhammad ibn Ismail or something like that, they would narrate it as by his kunya. So technically that's his kunya, he's Abu so-and-so, but nobody knows him as that. So it looks like it's a different narrator, when in reality it's the same narrator. So he's attributing it to the right person, but he's naming him in a way that people wouldn't actually know.
Can you choose the example again? You said if his name was Muhammad ibn Ismail, they would narrate him as
by his kunya, like Abu Muhammad or something, or
Ibn name.
Right, or Muhammad al-Hanafi, or they would just give it. So technically it's referring to the same person, but nobody knows him by that name. So like if he had a nickname, they refer to him as his nickname, where technically that is his nickname, but if you ask anybody who is this guy, nobody's going to know who he is. So these are the two main types that the author mentioned, and I'll go into them in a little bit more detail right away. But first, I'll just mention that the author only mentioned 2 types of Tadlîs. In reality, there's about 10 types. Some of them I'll go into, and some of them I won't. I'll go into each one's now. So whether you want to write them or not, one type is called Tadlîs al-Isnâd. So this type of Tadlîs is when a narrator narrates something from someone who he met, but he didn't actually hear from. But he gives phrasing that would indicate that maybe he heard from him. So we know that it's possible that a scholar would meet another scholar, but never actually hear something from them, or never narrate a hadith from him. So this is a dangerous type in the sense that if you look at their birthdays and you look at who they met and everything, you'll find that everything lines up, but in reality maybe they didn't actually hear this hadith from them. So this is one type, and you can see why it's considered Tadlîs, because obviously they're giving the impression that they did hear from him, but obviously they didn't hear this specific hadith maybe from him. So this is one type. The second type is called Tadlîs al-Shuyûkh, and this is, as I mentioned, that it's that their shaykh that they're narrating from is mentioned, but they're mentioned in a way that doesn't clearly indicate who that person is. And just to give a concrete example of this, or an actual example, there's a narrator named Atiyya ibn Sa'ad al-Awfi, and he was known for this type of tadlis. So an example of how he would do this, he would narrate from the Sahabi Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, who was, obviously we know, he's a companion. He would also narrate from another narrator whose name was Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, who was from the Tabi'een. So he was a lower level. He was a level lower than the Sahaba, and he was this narrator was known as being a liar. And this Ibn al-Sa'ib, or Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib, his kunya was Abu Hisham. So everybody knew him as Abu Hisham. And this Hisham, or his son Hisham, was also a liar, just like his father. But he also had another son whose name was Sa'id. So sometimes when he would narrate something from this Abu Hisham, he would sometimes just say from Abu Sa'id. So we see here that if he's known as narrating from Abu Sa'id the companion, and he's also he narrates from this other tabi'i, who's Abu Hisham, instead of saying Abu Hisham told me whatever, or I heard from Abu Hisham, he would say I heard from Abu Sa'id. Who's everyone going to think Abu Sa'id is when he first says that? Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Although this other person could be Abu Sa'id as well, because he had a son named Abu Sa'id. But everyone's going to they're going to think, okay, well, he narrates from Abu Sa'id and he also narrates from Abu Hisham. People aren't going to originally think by default the liar is Abu Sa'id, not Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. So this is a type of tadlis, and we can see again why it's dangerous, because you're tricking people into thinking that it's an authentic narration. So it isn't merely that the whole point of it is to get rid of liars and weak people out of the chain. So you're doing this with this intention. So it's a very, very dangerous thing, and a very, an important thing to know. But at the same time, it's very difficult to know without having a lot of study into the issues of the narrations and the issues of the asanid and the men of the chains. A third type is called Tadlîs al-Taswiya. So this is Tadlîs, we can call it of equalizing or leveling. So this is when the narrator hears a hadith from his shaykh, who is a trustworthy shaykh, and his shaykh hears it from a weak narrator, and then that weak narrator heard it from a trustworthy narrator, so he removes that person out of it. So he's not necessarily performing tadlis in what he heard, he's removing a person higher up in the chain. So for example, he'll say, my shaykh told me from, and then he'll say from two shaykhs above him, so which is a way to remove that, to remove that weak narrator out of the chain. So so he's removing somebody 2 levels up or 3 levels up out of the chain, instead of removing someone directly from that was his shaykh. A fourth type is called Tadlîs al-Buldan, or a Tadlîs of the areas or the cities or the countries, whatever you want to call it. So this is when someone might say, I heard from so and so in or behind or past the river. So generally, they might have a specific idea of what river that he's talking about, but he actually means a different river, maybe in his city. So instead, it makes it look like he's actually traveled far away and heard from other narrators. In reality, he's talking about maybe his own city. He heard from someone in the river that he's talking about is like a river in his city, instead of meaning like the Nile or the Tigris River or so those ones. So generally, they use a phrasing that indicates something about where they heard it, when in reality they didn't hear it that way. So it's similar to Tadlîs al-Shuyûkh, in the sense that they're using something in a way that people aren't going to expect.
And what's it called? Tadlîs.
Al-Buldan. Another type, it's quite rare, but I'll just mention it anyway. It's called Tadlîs al-Qata', or the Tadlîs of pausing. So what this would be is, for example, if a narrator would say, they want to make it look like they heard something from someone. So if they say, so-and-so told me, then, or if they say, I heard from so-and-so, then obviously they would be lying because they didn't actually hear it from him. So what some of them would do is they'd say, I heard, and then they'd pause, giving some time in between, and then they would say, from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so. So they're giving that impression that they heard from so-and-so, from so-and-so, but what they're saying is they're just saying, I heard, and then they're ignoring it, and they're saying from so-and-so, and they're attributing it to someone that they didn't actually hear it from now. So, and this is very rare, but it is a type that was known from some narrators. And then there's a number of other types, which I won't go into now, just because it'll take too long. But there's Tadlîs al-Sigh, Tadlîs al-Mutaba'a, Tadlîs al-Mutun, Tadlîs al-Irsal, Tadlîs al-Atf, and some other types. So, but the point behind all of it is that a narrator is intentionally using a specific phrasing to give the impression that they've heard something that they didn't actually hear, or they heard from someone that they didn't actually hear, or they heard in a place that they didn't actually hear, and so on. So generally it's to cover up a defect that's in the chain, and they don't want it to be known. So this is Tadlîs, and so we'll move on from there. The next thing that the author says, وَمَا يُخَالِفُ ثِقَةٌ بِهِ الْمَلَى فَالشَّاذُ وَالْمَقْلُوبُ قِسْمَانِ تَلَى. So next he's talking about the Shâdh narration, and he says, the one by which the trusted contradicts the greater number, anomalous is it, or it is, while the switched are two in number. So next he's talking about the Shâdh narration, and he translates Shâdh as anomalous. So he's saying Shâdh, which is anomalous, is when a trusted person, so a trustworthy narrator, contradicts trustworthy narrators who are more than him in number, or who are considered more accurate in their narration. So for example, someone who's trustworthy says that he heard from his shaykh this specific hadith. Then you have another student of the same shaykh saying he heard the same hadith, but he narrates it in a different way, and he's considered more accurate. So in this situation, we would look to the one who's considered more accurate, because if two of them are narrating something from the same person, but they contradict each other, then we obviously need some way of reconciling or figuring out which of the two we're going to take. So the one thing we would look to is the accurateness of the narrator. So if it's known that the one narrator makes mistakes, for example, say 4 out of every 10, while the other one makes mistakes 1 out of every 10, we're going to go with the one who makes mistakes 1 out of every 10. Another way of seeing which we would accept would be based on numbers. So for example, if 5 narrators narrate a hadith one way, and one narrator narrates the hadith a different way, unless the one narrator is considered much more accurate, by far than those other 5, then we're going to go with the higher number, because it's less likely that 5 narrators would come together on a specific way of narrating a hadith and be incorrect, while the one person would have the correct way of relating the hadith. So this is what the definition of Shâdh is, and again, this is a narration in which or this is a type of in the sciences of hadith. This is an issue that very often gets overlooked. So, and the reason for this is, if you look at the chain, it's connected the people are trustworthy, but so the defect in the hadith isn't based upon the person being a liar or the person being untrustworthy or not being accurate or not meeting his shaykh or something like that. It's something outside of the chain in and of itself. So if you just looked at the chain, it would be an authentic chain. So people who only look at the outwardness of the chain, they would say, yeah, that's an authentic hadith, we're going to accept it. But really, if you delve deeper into the issue or into the matter, you start to find, well, yes, it's an authentic chain, but there's a more authentic chain that says the hadith differently. So in this case, we would have to look at that as being a defect as well. So just some examples of this. Al-Bukhari has a small book or a small collection of hadith related to raising the hands in the salat. So he collected the hadith about raising the hands in the salat. He narrates from Abdullah ibn Umar that he used to raise his hands in all of the takbirs during Salat al-Janazah. So takbir al-Ihram, and then after the Fatiha, and after the Ibrahimiyya, and then just before the takbir. So he would raise his hands with each takbir. This is from Abdullah ibn Umar. This is the authentic narration. There's some less authentic narrations that have it that the Prophet ﷺ himself would do it. So we see here that some narrators mentioned that it was from the Prophet ﷺ. Those who are more accurate mentioned that it's from Abdullah ibn Umar. So we see here that the defect isn't in the weakness of the chain. The defect is in the fact that better narrators said that it's from Abdullah ibn Umar, and I guess weaker, not necessarily weaker, but not as strong narrators attributed it to the Prophet ﷺ. So in this case, the scholars of hadith judged that it's actually from the action of Abdullah ibn Umar as opposed to the action of the Prophet ﷺ. Likewise, some other examples of a Shâdh hadith. For example, the narrations about waving the finger during tashahhud. So we know that it's authentic to point the finger, and the chain itself of waving the finger is authentic, the chain itself, but it's the same hadith essentially. So because one says that he would point it and then wave it, and the other one just says he would point it. So strong scholars of hadith have judged that the waving phrase is something that's considered shadh, and the pointing is considered the correct narration of the hadith. Likewise, pointing the finger between the two prostrations. So there's a hadith that mentions that the Prophet ﷺ would perform sujood and then sit up, and then it describes his sitting during or between the two between the two sujood, that he would, how he would put his feet and how his legs would be in his arms. One of them mentions that he would point his finger. The stronger narrations mention that he would just have his hands on his legs. So that's considered also to be a shadh narration. And then there's some others that we talked about before, the recitation of Surah Al-Kahf on Jum'ah. The correct narration is that it's any day of the week. So that benefit or that virtue of reciting Surah Al-Kahf applies to any day of the week. It's not specific to Jum'ah, and so on. So this is, again, if you just looked at the outward appearance of the hadith or of the sanad, it would be considered an authentic hadith. So it shows the importance of looking further than that when judging whether a hadith is considered acceptable or not. So this is the shadh. Then what does he have next? And then so now he's mentioning the Maqlûb. So he says, وَالْمَقْلُوبُ قِسْمَانِ تَلَا إِبْدَالُ رَاوٍ مَا بِرَاوٍ قِسْمُ وَقَلْبُ إِسْنَادٍ لِمَتْنٍ قِسْمُ. So he's talking about what's called Maqlûb. So he translates it here as switched. So we're talking now about the Maqlûb hadith or the switched hadith. So he says, while the switched are two in number, the first, a switch within the chain, one person for another, but the flipping of the chain to another text, that is the other. So here he's talking about the Maqlûb hadith. So he says one type of Maqlûb, or one type of switching, is that men in the chain of narration are switched for someone else. So meaning there's a mix-up or a switch of the narrators in the chain. And the second type is that the chain of one text is switched to another. So for example, you have a hadith from so-and-so, from so-and-so, from so-and-so, that the Prophet ﷺ said this, and then you have a second one where the narrators say from so-and-so, up to the Prophet ﷺ. Someone narrates the one hadith with the opposite chain, and then the other hadith with the opposite chain. So they somehow mix up the wrong chain to the wrong hadith. So he's saying here these are the two types of Maqlûb hadith. In reality, there's two types of qalb, so two types of switching. One is related to the chain and one is related to the matan, or the text of the hadith. Both of these, if we look at them, they're both related to the chain though, because one is that he switched one man for another, and one is that the whole chain was switched to another hadith. So this is for an example of switching one man for another. There's a narrator named Ka'b ibn Murrah, and there's also a narrator named Murrah ibn Ka'b. So if the narrator narrated the hadith and said from Ka'b ibn Murrah, when in reality it's supposed to be Murrah ibn Ka'b, he switched the names, and we can see obviously why they're very similar names, and that would be considered, in and of itself, would be considered a defect, unless we have other chains to show that, what the correct narration would be. Likewise, a narrator named Sa'd ibn Sinan and Sinan ibn Sa'd, the same thing would obviously happen with that their names would be mixed up, because one is the name and then the father's name and then opposite for the other person. So this is just one type of switching when it comes to the chain. And another type of switching would be when the whole chain is switched to another hadith. So they take, for example, the chain related to this hadith and they put it to the other hadith and opposite. Sometimes that would be done for a number of reasons. Sometimes it was done just to test the narrators. So they might mention a number of ahadith and say, with the chain of narration, and they'd mention a bunch and say, fix this now, put the right chain to the right sanad and that type of thing, just to see how accurate and how knowledgeable the scholar of hadith was. This is something that's permissible to do, but it has to be that the intention is just to test the person, and then you need to make sure that it's clarified within the same sitting or the same meeting, which is the correct thing, so that it doesn't end up getting mixed up. Another reason as to why people would do this was to fabricate a hadith. So they might come and say, take an authentic chain of narration out of Sahih al-Bukhari or whatever collection it is, and just make up a hadith and then say this is the sanad for it. So this would be considered obviously a type of fabrication and a type of lie on the Prophet ﷺ. So that wouldn't be allowed, and it would clearly be a defect, because this isn't even a real hadith, and the chain doesn't belong to that hadith. So obviously it's considered a defect.
How would you decipher that if they could put an authentic chain to a fake hadith?
I mean, they'd have to, first of all, they'd look at, one of the obvious things would be, does this text of the hadith openly contradict something in Islam? So if it openly contradicts clearly something in the Quran or something in an authentic hadith, obviously we know there's something wrong here. That would be the first narration, the first indication of it. Another way would be, say we have, so that they're attributing that the Prophet ﷺ said something and this person heard it and this person heard it all the way down the chain. Generally, it's rare that it would only keep one chain the whole way, right? Because we know, each sheikh would have a number of students, and then it would go on and on and on. If you only find it this way, what happened to every other level of every other person and every level of the chain? How it never got passed on anywhere except in this direct chain. So that would be another indication. Another way would be, who collected the hadith? who's actually saying that this is the chain to the hadith?
Well, they
Just some guy. He doesn't even, he's not even a scholar of hadith. He's just some, whatever. And you say, well, how come none of the scholars of hadith collected this hadith with this chain? Like, where did you come up with this? So there's a number of, ways, and there's other ways. Like sometimes the narrator or the liar would just come out and say, I made this hadith up, or so generally it would be to first of all to find the indications that this doesn't make sense, and then to go from there to try to investigate kind of how it could have come this way.
But that seems like the most common one. When you said where the person that collected it, the one that's mentioning the hadith, if it's just like some random guy.
Right. For example, like the chain that this person is using, it's Imam al-Bukhari's chain. How come he didn't narrate it? Like this is a chain that he always narrates with. From his sheikh. Somehow he didn't narrate it. No one who narrates with that chain narrated it, but you ended up with this. Like, obviously that's a defect.
And is it true? Is authentic that the 10 guys came to Bukhari with each one of the hadiths to test them, and they mixed up the wording of the hadith and the chain, and
Some people say that, but at the same time, some scholars of hadith have said that it's unlikely that took place, just because there's no authentic chain or source of that story.
Oh, okay.
And they didn't used to generally do that type of thing very often. But I mean, that doesn't mean that his knowledge wasn't. I mean, if you look in his books, the things that are in his books show greater knowledge than that would anyway. Like the knowledge that he would have of defects of a hadith and the knowledge of the men of hadith, like it's greater than that story would show anyway. Yeah. And
and also the one you heard when the narrator, I think it was Bukhari, they said he's going to narrate, like he traveled so long and seen the man with the tricks on his horse, and then he just turned his back and.
There's some stuff like that, yeah. So this is just kind of an example of how this switching would take place in the chain. Another type of switching would be in the text of the hadith. So meaning something was mixed up in the actual text of the hadith that tells us that this specific phrasing of a hadith is wrong. So for example, Imam Muslim narrated the hadith. Most people know that there's 7 سبعة يظلهم الله في ظله يوم لا ظل إلا ظله, or that there's 7 which Allah will place in His shade on the day in which there's no shade except for His shade. One of them is وَرَجُلٌ تَصَدَّقَ بِصَدَقَةٍ فَأَخْفَاهَا حَتَّى لَا تَعْلَمَ شِمَالُهُ مَا تُنْفِقُ يَمِينُهُ, or that one of the 7 is that is a man who gives sadaqah or gives charity, and he hides it to the point where his left hand doesn't know what his right hand is doing. There's another narration, Imam Muslim narrated the same hadith, but it says حتى لا تعلم يمينه أو حتى لا تعلم يمينه ما تنفق شماله, or that he hides it to the point where his right hand doesn't know what his left hand was giving as sadaqah. So they say obviously there was a switch, because we have 2 narrations of the same hadith. One mentions that the right hand is giving the sadaqah, and one mentions that the left hand is giving the sadaqah. We know that good things in Islam are generally to be done with the right hand, and we know specifically that there's a hadith about giving and taking to be done with the right hand. So they've said here that this was a switch in the chain, or the switch, in the text of the hadith, that indicates that specific narration is a weak narration. So the correct narration is that it's so that his left hand doesn't know what his right hand is giving or giving in charity. And that, like I said, is narrated by Muslim from Abu Hurairah. And another narration or another example of that is when Imam al-Bukhari narrated from the Prophet ﷺ in Hadith of Abu Hurairah that he said, فإذا أمرتكم بشيء فأتوه ما استطعتم وإذا نهيتكم عن شيء فاجتنبوه. or that he said, فَإِذَا نَهِيتُكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ وَإِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِأَمْرٍ فَأْتُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, or that the Prophet ﷺ said, if I forbid you from something, then abstain from it, and if I command you with something, then do from it whatever you can. So here we know that it's easier to not do something. You can completely stop doing something, and generally that has a lot less to do with ability as opposed to doing something. So there's things that we might be asked to perform that we don't have the ability to perform. But when it comes to forbiddances or things that are forbidden or haram, it's much less likely that we won't be able to fulfill that due to ability, because it's asking us to stop doing something. So this hadith from Abu Hurairah was narrated by Al-Bukhari with this phrasing. There is one narrated by At-Tabarani from Abu Hurairah as well with the opposite phrasing. So that if I command you to do something, then do it, and if I forbid you from something, then stay away from it as much as you are able. So there's a switch in that, obviously the ability was placed as a condition for the forbiddances and not for the commands. So here they judge that because there's a more correct narration that has the phrasing opposite, plus if we look at the rules of the Sharia, generally things that are haram are to be stopped outright. Things that are obligatory or recommended are to be performed with the best of ability. So the ability is much more tied to performances as opposed to abandoning things or leaving things. So this is the end of the discussion about the Maqlûb hadith. Next he'll talk about the fard, which inshallah I'll stop there for today, and then we'll go into the fard inshallah on Sunday. Wallahu a'lam.